Now you're going to make sure you grab these safety glasses, and you'll notice they're numbered, that belong to your station. So when it's your turn, if you're in station 1, you're going to come up, grab station 1 safety glasses, put them on. Alright, you are going to be staining your clock. Before you go back there to do that, there's a couple of things you need to do. The first one is, you should have your first and last name written in pen, preferably on the bottom. If you use marker, that's fine as well. But you should have your first and last name written on the bottom. Your clock face should say no sand. I would also write your name or your initials on the bottom of that as well. You then have your charging station all glued up now, and you should have your name or initials written on the bottom of that as well, just so that way you know which one is yours. Once you have all those pieces, you're going to come back to stain. Now, as it's said and is called, it is stain. So the first thing you need to do is put on a pair of gloves, and these are not latex, so you shouldn't have any allergy issues, and your instructor will point out where you'll get them. But you're going to notice there should be some tables set up, and they'll have a can or two of stain, and there'll be some rags around them, and you'll notice this table right here is set up for about 6 people to stain at a time. You're going to go ahead and you're going to come over and you're going to stain. Now when you go to stain, you have a couple of options. There's going to be a lighter color, which will most likely be a natural, and there's going to be a darker color, which will be, in my classroom, a driftwood, right? But you're going to have a natural and a darker color. I'm going to go ahead and stain my clock with the darker color. But what's going to happen is your instructor will most likely have opened the can up. If they haven't, ask them to, and make sure that they've stirred it. They'll tell you if they have or haven't. You're going to get a rag though, and you're going to stain everywhere but where it says no sand on those 2 pieces. You're going to stain. Your base is going to get stained everywhere. So I'm going to start with my base, and if you notice, you have your grain lines, and you get to the end. This is called the end grain. The end grain absorbs much more stain than anywhere else. So I'm going to take my rag and I'm going to dip it in the stain. And it might kind of drip, so you let it drip in the can a little bit. Then you bring it out over here to the end grain. And you'll see it absorb into the end grain. And it'll actually kind of start to run down the front because it's like a bunch of little straws. I then would go to the other side of the end grain, do the same deal. Now when I go to stain, I do not want it to look wet. I want it to look dry when it's all said and done. So if it's shiny and wet, you've got too much stain on there. You're going to go ahead and you're going to put a thin coat on both the face and the edges. Dip into the can as you need to, but once again, less is more when it comes to staining. You want as light a coat as possible. I shouldn't say light, but as thin a coat as possible, which means you want it to look dry. So you wipe with the grain the entire time. Now you want to make sure you stain the bottom as well. Our name should be on there in pen, so when we stain it doesn't matter. So you'll see the name still shows up. But once again, I put a light coat on the bottom. Now if you get too much on, you can take one of the drier parts of the rag, wipe it up. But you'll notice it looks nice and dry. That's the way I want it to look. You can always go back to your end grain and make sure you didn't miss any spots. If it looks a little too wet, kind of dry it up with your rag a little bit. But you then would go ahead and do the same to the other pieces. Now the charging station is a little bit tricky. I'm going to start with the face first. Don't stain here. So once again, I got to follow the lines. My end grain are right here on this half circle and right here. And then this is kind of like end grain as you go through this curve. But once again, I go ahead and dip that rag just a little bit in there. Make sure I let it drip into the can. If I get a puddle like that did, I'll show you what to do. But I start with the end grain because it's going to absorb more. I then go to my face and I wipe it up. Now once again, you want it to look dry. If you get too much, simply take part of that rag just like you would to that puddle, wipe it up, okay? Once again, don't stain the bottom. I simply do the end grain and the face. I then would move on to my charging station. Now my charging station, this is going to be end grain. The inside's going to be end grain, and then this is going to be end grain. So I start with those spots. And there's a lot of little nicks. There's a lot of little corners and kind of nooks and crannies, so you want to just take your time with this one. But you're going to stain the end grain on the inside, the end grain on the outside. Because once again, that absorbs more stain than any of the other parts. And that means you got to kind of turn it around in your hands. If you get a little bit of stain like I did here, it's fine. You want to leave it as bare as possible though. You're then going to go to the other side of the end grain. And you'll notice the more you stain, the more stain gets in the rag and the less stain you have to dip in there. Now there's a possibility you might have some dry spots, and that's because if glue leaked out and you didn't wipe it up, it will not look like it gets stained because it already has glue there, so it can't absorb any stain. But once again, once you're done with the end grain, you're going to go back, and it's kind of tricky on this one. Like I said, you got to kind of squeeze that rag in there, get the top edge of that inside piece, the front edge, you got to kind of dig your hand in there. Do the same to this front piece, right? Top edge, do the same. But so you really have to kind of turn it around, look at it, make sure you haven't missed anywhere. Once again, notice I'm kind of pushing that rag, really getting that stain out of there. I haven't dipped it in there for a while because the more you go, the more stain gets in the rag, and then you can just simply squeeze a little harder and get that rag into the corners, the crevices. Double check the inside, the back. Make sure you didn't miss anywhere. Once again, don't stain the bottom, but stain all the way to the bottom edges. Much as you can, go with the grain. Alright, once again, if I wipe up the table, if I got any on there. Sometimes too, if you need just a little bit more, you can kind of take the rag, wipe around on the inside edge, because a lot of times there's some fresh stain just sitting right there. And then wipe it on if you need any spots. Once you get done with all three pieces though, go back and make sure there aren't any spots that you missed. Sometimes as it absorbs into the end grain, you find some dry spots. If you got some that's a little too wet, and by now the rag's been dried out, clean it off. If your rag has got way too much stain in it, and it won't let you dry it off, let your instructor know. They can help get you a rag to help dry some of that off. But once it's all dry, you're going to go ahead, kind of set them the way you want them, and your instructor will tell you where to put those. But you'll have a spot where you're going to set those off to the side. If you're the last person staining, you're going to put the lid back on. You'll set your rag over in your spot where you're staining. You then will take your gloves, and you'll grab your thumb and index finger on the inside lip of one glove, roll it up, into a ball so the dirty part's on the inside. You do the same on the other one. That way you don't have to worry about getting anything on you. You'll then find the nearest trash can, wherever that might be, and you'll throw your gloves in the trash.